I welcome my colleague, a friend, a colleague in the field of contemporary and modern African art, an art historian, Professor Chika Okeke-Agulu from Princeton University. His biography there, but I just wanted to say from a personal perspective that Chika has been a friend, a colleague, and we work together on many, many projects. Most important among them is Inca Journal of Contemporary African Art, plus so many other things within the field, whether it's collaborations in projects, curatorial or others. But what is also most important that this book actually brings us together is our colleague, mutual colleague, the late Okwui Enwezor, who is a co-author with Chika of this book. The book is entitled Anatsui, The Reinvention of Sculpture, and it's published by Damiani, which is an Italian press. The book was available. Whatever copies we have is sold out. So whoever has a copy, it's a treasure. Chika will give us the honor of assigning them after this keynote address. The keynote address is titled El Anatsui, Metamorphic and Shape-Shifting. Many of you, as you know, that El Anatsui is a Ghanaian, but he's also a Nigerian. And the most important is that the relationship between the two authors and El Anatsui, which goes back, especially for Chika, that he was actually a student of El Anatsui at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. So please join me in welcoming Chika Okeke giving the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salah, for introducing me, and thanks to the institution, the Africa Institute, for making this conference possible. It indicates the possibilities of collaboration between the cultural institutions that Chika has been spearheading here in Sharjah over these past many years, and African institutions and peers and collaborators. Today I will be speaking about El Anatsui's work, of course in honor of the book that just came out. On this day, 3 years ago, the exhibition El Anatsui Triumphant Scale opened at the Haus der Kunst, Munich. That exhibition, co-organized with my dear departed friend, Okwui Enwezor, was our opportunity to survey the work of an artist we believed and still believe is peerless in his insistence on subjecting his chosen sculptural media to vigorous analysis until he extracted from it a new and significant formal language. In that exhibition, and especially in the newly published book, we examined Anatsui's decades-long exploration of wood, terracotta, and metal, ideas about fragmentation, fragility, that led to the invention of a type of sculptural object that is at once epic and metamorphic, and what all these had to do with histories of migration of his West African Ewe people and the violence of the European-African colonial encounter. This evening, however, I want to share my thoughts on this very notion of the metamorphic to show why it constitutes a radical intervention on how we might think about the sculptural object. I explore by focusing on Anatsui's metal sculptures, how the metamorphic might help us to make sense of the most fundamental, yet not well understood or under-theorized qualities of his work. I begin with two questions that should frame the ideas I will explore tonight. First, in what specific ways do the bottle cap sculptures by Anatsui constitute, as I want to argue, a new type of sculptural objecthood? And second, what sort of conceptual frameworks and ideas underwrite and inform these formal inventions? At the 2007 Venice Biennale, Anatsui presented two monumental sculptures, Dusasa I and Dusasa II, at the Arsenale alongside other leading contemporary artists. In that cavernous and austere space, these two metal works staged a memorable presence with their simultaneously powerful, muscular, organic, flowing, fragile form, and lustrous metal colors. Anchored to two massive, rough-surfaced brick columns, each work amplified the Arsenale's paradoxical atmosphere as a site of pre-industrial production and New Age museological display, where the partially restored columns exuded structural stability in a way that reminded us of Venice's maritime and military power at the dawn of Europe's age of exploration. Anatsui's two works defiantly invested the space with an unmistakably post-colonial aesthetic and history. That is, they, like other works in this medium, are product of a sculptural imagination that is simultaneously well-versed in the languages of sculpture spanning diverse modalities of Western and African art and craft, yet deployed as both homage to, critique, and meditation on these visual archives. Moreover, the striking artisanal opulence of their energetic wave-like forms, as well as their irregular, hand-stitched, colorful, metallic elements, overwhelmed the spatial geometry of the Arsenale. The visual drama orchestrated by the installation prompted a distressed and confused New York Times critic, confronted by what he called an unruly diversity of recent art in the Arsenale, to claim that the Dusasa pair provided him, quote, a rare dose of sheer eye candy, unquote. While the critic was not alone in finding the two Anatsui sculptures unusually attractive, his misapprehension of, that is, his inability to process their visual impact, that is, seeing them as sheer eye candy, reflects perversive and conflicting characterization of them by viewers in and beyond Venice. By virtue of their optical effects, structural form, material property, and mode of fashioning, commentators in academic and popular fora describe these works made of liquor bottle tops and similar metallic elements as metal fabrics, cloths, sculptures, wall hangings. It is as if the new body of work had become the elephant, its spectators the 6 blind men of the ancient Buddhist parable, each with markedly different perception of the polymorphic animal object. As Robert Storr has argued, Anatsui's objects elude, quote, our common capacity to name them while testing beyond their limits the vocabulary we have inherited from the past, unquote. Thus, after comparing Anatsui's work with Donald Judd's specific objects that combine elements of sculpture and painting, the draped and pinioned canvases of Sam Gilliam, the modular and participatory conceptual drawings of Saul Lewitt, and the woven kente cloths of the Akan, Storr concluded that Anatsui has, quote, engendered a fresh paradigm for abstraction and conjured a heretofore unanticipated context in which that paradigm can and will flourish, unquote. The fascination in the literature with the impossibility of fixing Anatsui's work into existing categories of objects recognized by art historians has not abated. And here I focus on the ontology of these metal works, that is, in their structural materiality and in the ideas, concepts that make them significant forms, expressive objects, and bearers of cultural meaning. So let us return to the Dusasa pair and other exemplary metal works to examine the form and manifestations of the unique sculptural entities I am calling Anatsui's metamorphic objects. In Venice, Dusasa I was a vast, abstract, predominantly golden field constituted by countless crushed, twisted, pierced, sliced aluminum bottle caps and seals stitched together with copper wires. To fully see the entire work, the viewer must stand back several feet away, at which distance the individual elements resolve into bold areas of color and texture. Vertical bands of ochre, gray, cadmium yellow, and deep red run through the entire field. Whereas on the left are 2 roughly semicircular motifs reminiscent of Uli's spiral forms that frequently appeared in his wood sculptures and drawings. What might be 2 other curvilinear forms on the right are caught in the massive S-shaped waves billowing across the pictorial field. The dominant one starting from the lower left, dipping to the floor, rising, breaking once in the midsection, but inexorably continuing towards the upper right. Echoing this, the minor wave emerges from the floor around the center, only managing to reach the middle right, cut off by the vertical fold originating from the extreme low right. The raking light from the above and resulting the form-defining shadows accentuates the 3-dimensional and sculptural heft of these monumental waves. But if these 2 and 3-dimensional elements constitute the overriding visual and formal character of the work, on closer view, and because of its scale, other elements become obvious. These include the different stitch patterns, the details of the diverse color shapes and arrangements, the interaction of forms seen from different angles, the plenitude of printed text on the individual bottle caps and seals, and the bewildering number of small parts woven into a field of textural, formal, and optical excess. Dusasa II, smaller in scale, and positioned across the space from Dusasa I, showed the range of technical procedures Anatsui had developed with the liquor bottle medium at this point. More sober and meditative, Dusasa II, from a distance, is monochromatic, and because it largely consists of two stitch patterns, is texturally more consistent. Absent are any defining shapes or motifs, and the result is a fairly consistent field of color that somehow managed to suggest a centrally positioned figure in mid-leftward stride. This figure might be the figment of the viewers or my imagination, yet it is like the billowing waves in Dusasa I, the outcome of an intuitive process of folding, bundling, and fixing the pliable metal medium at the moment of their specific installation. More crucially, it exists only archivally, that is, as a formal and iconographic element of the work Anatsui called Dusasa II, but only as it appeared in that space, and this is very important, and at that time. To speak and write about these objects, in other words, we must assume that such enterprise can only be provisional. For each reinstallation in the same or different space results in a physical and formal manifestation that can be mildly or radically dissimilar from the previous ones. So consider the formal biography or metamorphic phases of Dusasa in the years after Venice. Acquired soon after the biennial, Dusasa I and Dusasa II appeared respectively in the galleries of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City and the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 2008. Reinstalled 3 times, now at the Met in 2008, 2010, and 2020, and presented in 2 venues in 2019, Dusasa II has had a total of 5 lives, each time with a substantially different appearance. The phantom figure that I was referring to in Venice in 2007, for instance, gave way to numerous lateral tremulous waves, the entire work reminiscent of sloughing dead tissue of a gargantuan prehistoric animal. Moreover, because of the depth and direction of the crumples, the dimensions of the 2008 work skewers towards the horizontal, quite different from the more vertically disposed Venice version. In the other 3 manifestations of the piece, while on tour and upon its return at the Met, its format vacillated, stretching upwards or sideways, just as the form that constitutes its compositional character morphed without logic or according to any sensible pattern. We can track the many lives of Anatsui's other metal works by paying attention to documentation of each work, following their reinstallations in the same venue or in the course of the journeys across several exhibitions. Thus, some of his more traveled works, including Red Block on the screen, and its pendant Black Block, both of 2010, featured in the Gravity and Grace exhibition that year, and of course in the Triumphant Scale exhibitions, that combined to a total of 8 venues in the past 10 years, each manifested in different ways, not counting reinstallations in their home museums. In the formal transformations that come with the representation of the 2 works that Anatsui conceived as pendant pieces, we observe radical swings in their formal dispositions and character, from the mild-mannered to the muscular and forceful. At Munich and more also at Doha, Black Bloc even broke what until then was its largely rectangular format. 2 other major works, Intermittent Signal and Gravity and Grace, have gone further than just changing their shape. They demonstrated a propensity for displacement, that is, to renegotiate their relationship with walls and floors and with the phenomenological space they share with the viewer. When Intermittent Signals was first presented at the Jack Scheinman Gallery in New York, it was a massive rectangular wall relief with low amplitude perpendicular waves streaming across its entire surface. Several blue striped bands, mostly on the right, have emphasized this lateral orientation. Neither the red vertical, though creased color bar to the left, and differently textured patches, one beside the bar, the other at the far right, generate enough energy to counter the work's massive transverse visual order. Indeed, the stridently rectilinear top of this rectangular piece suggests a structure whose internal forces are strong enough to hold it up triumphantly against gravity. My observation here is consistent with that of the art historian Susan Vogel, who noted, quote, "Intermittent Signal can be read as a huge, confident, shining gold banner with a proud red band anchoring the end," unquote. Well, Vogel's description of Intermittent Signal in 2020, so I was quoting from her description of the work in 2020, reveals the problem noted earlier, that Anatsui's metamorphic objects present to the scholar, to the scholar's iconographic enterprise. For the work that I and she have just described ceased to exist many years ago. It had, so to say, moved on. So when in 2012 it was shown at the Clark Institute, it no longer occupied a flat wall. Rather, it had crawled over and barely supported by the adjacent wall. The stress of its movement evident in the turbulent downward contours to the right. It is as if this displacement compromised the work's structural confidence once it turned the corner, such that it falters inexorably, overtaken by gravity and entropy. In the subsequent installations between 2017 and 2020 at the Broad Museum, the rightward crawl continued while the entire form barely holds itself off the floor. Not to be missed in this account is that any factual description of this work must be contingent, tied to a specific time period and location. Thus, an informed characterization of it in 2020, as Susan Vogel did, and until it changes again, must include, besides its undulating profile and complex wave patterns, an acknowledgement of the immersive space it shapes with its commanding occupation of the gallery's perpendicular walls. That is why Vogel's comment on it in 2020 is, in the strictest sense of the word, anachronistic, as it is a faithful description of what the work was in the past tense in 2020, rather than what the viewer might have seen if you saw that work at the same time that she was describing it. Anatsui sculptures, in other words, are shape-shifters with a natural propensity to trip into obsolescence even the most sympathetic description of them. Thus, the art historian must remedy, only remedy is to insist on the contingency and time specificity of any study or reading of the artist's work that depends on its iconography and formal features. Anatsui's other works have gone steps further than the ones discussed so far in their formal and structural transformation. One of his best-known works, Gravity and Grace, which gave his eponymous traveling exhibition its name, is one such restless sculpture that, in terms of its form, composition, and structure, we could say has been all over the place. I have thus far described Anatsui's wall-bound metal sculptures, yet to see how it is possible to miss the profundity of the radical proposition he has made about the ontology of sculptural objecthood of his shape-shifting metal work. So it's not just the works that are wall-bound. After all, the incredulous critic might say, well, so long as we can note the basic stitch patterns, colors, lines in each work, no matter how much it twists, expands, or constricts on the wall, the discerning eyes could not be deceived into perceiving the different versions as autonomous works of art. Moreover, the dubious viewer might press further and say, well, ought not these works belong to that genre of contemporary art presented as variable dimensions? Well, I argue that such questions or observations derive from failure to appreciate the fact that the substantiality of transformation possible in each work goes beyond changes in its dimensions. That is, while the total material substance of the metal sculptures remain constant, as is the specific composition resulting from what the artist has called basic data that he provides for each work at the end of the studio process, the variability in form, design, and composition of each manifestation can be significant enough to constitute a unique, if impermanent, object. Part of the problem of adopting a proper response to Anatsui sculptures, I acknowledge, has to do with the genesis and arc of his experimentation with the non-fixed form, and also with the insistence by critics and the scholarship on locating his work strictly within the context of an unbroken African art and craft tradition. There is no question that Anatsui saw in the West African strip-woven textiles made by stitching bands made with narrow double-heddle looms as a structural model for rethinking wood sculpture. And when he moved from wood to metal, the textile craft of stitching and the physical properties of fabrics respectively, suggested to him the most effective mode of working his medium and of translating it into new, decidedly sculptural form. However, in being too quick and steadfast in tying Anatsui sculptures to African textiles without the requisite analytical nuance, critics lost sight of the fact that he is, first and foremost, a sculptor who thrives on transforming ordinary materials into media for sculpture, usually through laborious yet technically unsophisticated processes. The consequence is that in the non-critical, facile, and convenient association of the metal works with African textiles and fabrics, masks and vitiates what I consider their thrilling, if disorienting form. The necessity of articulating an autonomous space in which we can fully appreciate how this rhizomatic imagination birthed new forms of sculptural objecthood is just as vital and urgent as locating his practice within a broader discourse of post-colonial modernist critical engagement with African artistic traditions and expressive cultures. I have deliberately focused so far on describing the physical properties of Anatsui's shape-shifting sculptures primarily to impress on the audience their uniqueness as works of art and why they demand new modalities of reading and analysis. That is a different way of thinking about modern and contemporary sculpture. In doing this, I suspended two critical questions. First, what ideas motivate or cause these objects to assume different formal characteristics each time they enter into a new space, thus rendering any descriptions of them perpetually provisional? And second, what does it do to normative notions of sculptural objecthood? I'm concerned here in exploring how the contingent physicality of Anatsui's metal works derive from specific ideas he has espoused about sculpture. Beyond this, I examine how certain aspects of African aesthetics and philosophies of life underwrite Anatsui's sculptural theory and practice. In fact, that Anatsui normally expects curators and collectors of his metal sculptures to decide how to install them, but also because they are hand-wrought, flexible things with numerous parts that can behave in infinite ways when moved, how they are installed determines their composition, affect, and presence. Having conceived his work and invested so much labor, along with his many studio assistants, to realize it in sculptural form, ceding its inaugural and future manifestations to whoever has custody of the work is an extraordinary power to invest in others without much instruction or assertion of his own authorial intentionality. Anatsui invites the curator or whoever has custody of the work to participate in a continuous process of reanimating the giving new form to the work. That is, as creative agents whose actions contribute vitally to the biography of each work. His open invitation to others to participate in creating his work is tied to the view he has of them as analogical to living things that, once birthed in his studio, must embark on their own cyclical life journeys. In 2010, he stated, "I believe that the human life is something which is constantly in a state of change. And I want my artworks to replicate that experience. Each time they are brought out, it should be an opportunity for them to take on new shape. In reading the above statement, I contend that the question for Anatsui is how sculpture might replicate the effect of time on life, specifically the natural progression of the human life from birth to death. His commitment to the materiality and facture of sculpture, it seems, compelled him to conceive of his objects in a way that they enact the passage of time or respond to different spatial contexts through shape-shifting and physical transformation in the manner of animate or non-animated metamorphic forms. Yet, in comparing his work with human life, with its implication of a birth-to-death progression, does that imply that if his work has a moment of birth, presumably its completion in the studio, ready for the first installation, it must also reach a point of expiration or death? The resolution of this paradox must be found in the concept of human life as unfolding in a cyclical, metaphysical, rather than in a diachronic or biological time. I am thinking here of the view traditionally held in many West African religions that biologic life and death are but gateways along which a given life passes, not once, but severally through the mechanism of reincarnation. The philosopher Fayemi Kazim captures this in his description of time among the Yoruba when he argues that, quote, human time reckoning is cyclical. Its beginnings leads to an end, and each end, through transformation, leads to a new beginning, unquote. Whereas Anatsui sees the changes that occur in each work over multiple reinstallations as analogous to physical transformation associated with the biological human, I see the shape-shifting as operating in cosmological time, in the sense that each act of installation is a birth, followed by a momentary death, that is the deinstallation of the work, that lasts until its reincarnation, that is the next reinstallation. This understanding of reinstallation as rebirthing occasions the re-entrance into the art world of an entity that retains elements of its previous manifestations, as well as characteristics unique to the new work. But even if our cosmological reading here offers a way out of the conundrum of a living sculpture that must inexorably die, there is still critical value in keeping Anatsui's art as life analogy, as it allows us a view into his thinking about sculpture as implied by his declaration that every reinstallation should be an opportunity for them to take on a new shape. I consider the ambiguity, that is the lack of clarity and conceptual slippage here, as productive and necessary. For what we see as an invitation to other people to actively participate in the episodic rebirthing and reincarnation of the work must also be juxtaposed with its biologic schema, in which new shapes constitute distinct markers in the evolving life of an entity that theoretically has the potential to live forever. Seen this way, the reinstallers become not just witnesses to the life of the object, but hands-on stakeholders who must contribute to its growth process, its rites of passage. In addition to this artistic contemplation and vision of sculpture's emulation of life process is Anatsui's equally enduring investment in an ontology which is expressed in the popular maxim, "No condition is permanent." This, alongside the equally common Onye Maechi or Echi Diime, that is the Igbo for who knows tomorrow or tomorrow is pregnant, is one of the more ubiquitous affirmations among African peoples of the precarious place of human beings in the scheme of things. These maxims, pervasive in folk culture such as lorry signs, chapbooks, high life music titles, and in everyday speech, signify an understanding of the human experience and interaction as bound up with what Daniel Abiboah calls relations of contingency and futurity. It is this ontology, quite evident in African religions, that authorize the constant negotiations through ritual that humans must conduct with metaphysical forces and other active agents that inhabit the cosmos. More pertinently, no condition is permanent and who knows tomorrow speak to the quirky trajectory of history, the mystifying capriciousness of life, and the inscrutability of the yet to come. This philosophy of an attitude to life inevitably means that our understanding of the past, present, and future must always and necessarily be provisional. As Anatsui noted many years ago, this way of imagining the world explains the prevalence of orality as the primary mode of social discourse and remembering in African societies. Oral archiving of the past makes revision imperative. For each time the past is recalled by the historian, that is the griot, something is removed or added, thus recasting and reshaping the past. The past, thus, is not a fixed place, nor is it like the artwork in the museum. It is rather a site of constant revision that suits the needs of the present. And because the past, insofar as it exists in the memory of the living, is logically revisable, the present and the future are thus equally dependent as much on the whimsical fate as on the unpredictable actions of humans and metaphysical agents. Seen this way, no condition is permanent is thus about the future, but also about the past. This condition of provisionality and alterability, with all its philosophical and existential implications, informs Anatsui's attitude to sculpture. I've thus relied so far on the world of experience and on aspects of African culture and philosophy to make sense of Anatsui's shape-shifting work. Yet when it comes to the question of recognizing the uniqueness of the very idea of sculptural objects that shape-shift over time, and thus require an appropriate mode of reading or analysis, I identify an aspect of African ritual sculpture as a useful model. A well-known example might be the Mincondi, the so-called power figures of the Congo and related peoples of Central Africa. The best examples of these sculptures in museum collections are usually figurative wood sculptures, the surfaces of which are to various extents covered with nails, blades, knotted ropes, and diverse objects. However, in its original context, the typical Nkondi begins life as a carved wood object, which through an accretive process physically evolves, transformed by the actions or the addition of extraneous and efficacious materials. The wooden figure fashioned by the sculptor here serves as the literal base, what Anatsui might have called data, upon which the owner or the ritual specialist acts in the process of summoning or activating metaphysical powers resident in the object. Thus, with each ritual empowerment by the owner priest, another nail or object is fastened to the sculpture, the structure and shape ever so slightly transformed through the process of accretion. Perhaps it is this accretive aspect of the Mincondi that caused a 19th century visitor to the Congo to refer to it as, quote, a history book or communal archive. Just as the owner of the Mincondi might have seen the physical metamorphosis of the power figure as a natural process of its sculptural and ritual life, Anatsui imagined his sculptures as objects with physical character, with the intervention of its owner must then continue to evolve as it goes from time to time and from place to place. Their condition, we could say, is not permanent, for permanence denies them the ability, as Anatsui said, to emulate the experience of life. I make the connection here between Anatsui's sculptures and Mincondi not only to alert us to traditions of sculpture in which the object is physically transformed as a result of the action of people with whom it is intimately related, but also to compel us to a new appreciation of his inventive work and the radical proposition it makes to our understanding of sculpture. It is also to press for a mode of reading or writing about them that recognizes their non-static form and to insist on foregrounding the wealth of culturally embedded ideas that inform this work. The question then is this: if his sculpture is a work in perpetual progress, what theory of criticism or perception might we bring to bear on it? One place to find a possible answer is Chinua Achebe's Invocation of Masquerade, to explain the Igbo philosophical disposition on man's relationship with the dynamic forces responsible for existence. He notes that in the course of a masquerade, the spectator must mimic the mask's motion by not staying in a fixed position to fully enjoy the spectacle. He argues that the Igbo fashioned a proverb that says, "You do not stand in one place to watch a masquerade," to caution against the insufficiency of the partial perspective and the fixed position when confronted by dynamic subjects and phenomena. I signal here the hermeneutic value of the masquerade spectator, the spectator's constant repositioning, the substitution of the fixed position for the ambulatory perspective on a moving target, and argue that it models a mode of reading that can keep up with, rather than be rendered obsolescent by the sculpture's changing forms. In the face of Anatsui's metal sculptures, the question for us as viewers, critics, and historians is this: is it possible to do a definitive and confident reading of them based on what they looked like at the particular moment of our encounter, without the nagging doubt that what we write about them now will always make sense, as we are not sure what form they might take in the future? For sure, the titles may remain the same and the metal elements from which they are fashioned will remain constant, but the shape that they take, the different ways their various parts interact will change each time they are presented or represented to the public. And this is where their condition differs from the finitude of the human life. For they will not suffer if Anatsui's wishes are kept death's radical disruption. There is no question to conclude that Anatsui's metal sculptures, once seen for what they are, present us with the difficulty of situating ourselves within an unfamiliar yet intriguing knowledge world in which art objects are not the sole product of an authorial imagination. But this difficulty exists only because of the dearth or lack of models from the modern and contemporary archive for the type of sculptural object he has invented, and it is amplified by the convenient and habitual recourse to facile and fanciful terms that ultimately belie absence in present scholarship of proper critical language and discourse for these shape-shifting sculptures. Thank you.
Thank you for a remarkable lecture and a reading of Anatsui's work, moving beyond the old model of traditional African history that persists or insists on reading every new work of a modern artist in relation to the past, even though Anatsui doesn't ignore the past. But Anatsui's work really called for reading like yours, which is situated within the continuity of the modern and the contemporary, and that he is somebody who lives in between and within cultures, and that all of these factors are important in his work. His cosmopolitanism, his Ghanaian ancestry and heritage, visual culture, but it's also his experience in Nigeria and in many other places. So with this, I would like to invite just a few questions.
I just wanted to ask, when you look at all other kinds of African-based sculptures, is there a kind of language, like, do the critiques miss the point of most of the, and that's why you made the book? Do you understand me?
Yes, I do. Well, that's the whole point of writing the book, right? If you see this subtle move that I make, which is to say that there has been quite a bit of scholarship on Anatsui's work, and it's been read in ways that miss a lot of the point of the work itself, relying more on really facile terms, and that's what Salah was referring to. African art, you know what it's supposed to be and how it's supposed to be talked about. Anatsui, oh, well, there's kente cloth, and it must be that he's now a modern Ghanaian artist from a kente making tradition. And so when the work was initially installed at the Met, it was side by side, kente cloth, right? As if to say, well, the Africans have become modern, right? And this is part of the field within which a lot of African artists find themselves. The reason why quite a few would say, I am not an African artist when you ask them, I am an artist. It's because of this background in which their work is constantly misunderstood, misused, misapplied. And then that then becomes, oh, well, they are denying their identity, right? But that's not what this is about. It's the African that has been constructed by a scholarship that had no sympathies with where these artists are coming from. So he's only exemplary of this field of practice, but also the scholarship that have been built around these artists and their works.
I had a question about whether or not you engage the reluctance or the sort of challenges that people who are installing these works sometimes face. I imagine there's some resistance to being responsible for the way in which the work looks in their space, and whether or not you've observed any particular kind of patterns or tendencies that people use to explain or deflect or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, because what Anatsui is asking for is incredibly unusual for any kind of art, whether old or new art. Because of what I refer to as authorial intentionality, you want to know what the artist had in mind, right, and how the artist wanted the work. So even for artists like Sam Gilliam that I showed, the draped paintings, the instructions are so specific. So if that work were to travel to another museum, they will follow to the letter the distances, where you punch the tack in the wall to attach. But Anatsui says, I really don't care, right? And so what that means is he is delegating his authorial intentionality to people who don't see themselves as artists to begin with, and who refuse or are very uncomfortable taking that burden, right? But what Anatsui points to is, in fact, in a broader context, is that he talks about it takes a village to raise a child, right? And in that model of raising a child, you also placing burdens on teachers, on neighbors, on traders. Everybody takes on a role, and a role of responsibility. That's what he's asking for, right? That the curators, the preparators, we've had several instances where the preparators take millions of pictures of each work so that they monitor every fold when it was first installed and hope to replicate that. Now, you know that that's physically impossible, right? Because of the nature of the material. But they still insist on that. But you also see instances where curators take him at his word and do what they would like to do with the work. Now, don't ask me what he thinks about what they did, right, for each of these, because sometimes he thinks, it didn't quite work. But he wouldn't. But if he were to be in the installation space, he can walk up and say, and tuck this in, tuck that in, and move away. He wouldn't have any discussion with you, or you might do the same, right, if it's there or not. But in that case, he is participating like everyone else in the continuing remaking of the work. And he's fully aware that at some point he's not going to be there, and he's not leaving you any notes how these works will be reinstalled in the future, right? So there's that element, but it's also to insist on this notion of precarity, right, as an important aspect of how we think about things, because the modern world has fixed everything, right? It's even a critique of a way of knowing. That's why I invoked orality, right, versus written history, right? That within that context, historians are not worried about, that changed a little from the last retelling, right? Because in fact, that's part of the tradition. And that's a way of acknowledging that historians actually don't fix the past, they make the past, right? So it's a way of thinking about not just art, but life. And that's where the notion of no condition is permanent comes in.
Thank you very much. Your last comment might have resolved some of my question, but thank you for a fascinating lecture. I wish I was your student, just to put that as a preface. I'm interested in this condition of provisionality, because when I first saw the work at Zeitz-Mokke in South Africa, I was convinced I was seeing something cinematic in the work. And I wondered, just thinking about Abderrahmane Sessako's recent work on Timbuktu, whether you might think there's a kind of technological mediation that is available to us. Am I wrong to say that, there's something about the cinematic as a potentiality that gives us something like the provisional in the work?
I'm not sure about my memory capacity. So you should just take one at a time. Yes. One at a time, please. Yeah. Let me answer Primesh's question. Yes, we can invoke the cinematic, but what I'm suggesting is that that is not the generative site for this way of thinking about either sculptural objecthood or even the ontology, right, of both biological life and a cosmology that depends on cyclicality, that is on the cyclical movement of time and life. Now, that's where cinematic theorists could look to. And this is part of my insistence that I'm not too taken by frequent citation of European philosophers as if they are the only site of theoretical and philosophical knowledge. That we can think about a different turn whereby these kinds of knowledge systems become generative spaces for complex thinking, right? And about objects in this case, but also artworks that depend on time, right? And the movement of time in place.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a wonderful exposition. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the Mincondi. If you could tell us
Yes.
the principle of their additions to the sculptures over time. How did that work? Was it like within a family? Was there someone designated to do it? What was the context?
So these things exist before they are extracted from their original context, right? Either within a family or a community. They can exist for decades, right? That means that even the sculptor who carved the original wood or the ritual specialist who attached the first nail or package might not be there 20 years later when that object is still functioning within the context of family. And of course, this is not a place to go into why they do that. I'm just interested in the transformation of the object, right? That depending on how efficacious that Mincondi is in answering the problems of the owners, they will keep using it because it means that it's effective. Sometimes if it stops being effective, it's disposed of, right? That's, you might think, is similar to the moment it enters a museum, which means it dies, right? Within that, the context of its original making and use. So depending on how long the life of that particular Mincondi piece, it might mean that several people handled it, several ritual specialists, that it went from hand to hand if it existed as a family or communally owned object. So it's in the accretion that happens over time that I'm interested in. And yet we talk about it as if it's this fixed object. When, if you saw it in 1950, you would have much less things and you would have described it differently. If you saw it in 1982, it would have been fatter, perhaps even more complex as a form. The description will be different. And yet you're talking about the same object. It's that shape-shifting that I'm interested in, how it relates to a different kind of shape-shifting in the case of Anatsui's work.
Hi.
So, yeah, please.
So it's me next. Thank you so much for that. I had the pleasure of seeing the show when it went to Doha. And I think it was very much a revelation for me, the early works on paper, but also the works in wood, which is not something I was very familiar with in relation to his practice, given that we kind of associate it with these large monumental pieces. Mm-hmm. And I guess I was just curious, I know if you could maybe to reflect on some of his concerns when working in wood and also works on paper during those early years. Because I see an affiliation with landscape and abstraction much more so than necessarily like pattern making and textiles, the reference that you made here. I just wondered if you could just expound on that just a little bit more in terms of his thinking around that time.
Okay. Well, landscape is a genre, right, of art, landscape paintings, and that is not something that he was interested in It comes from a very different European tradition, the notion of landscape, right? He was never interested in that, but of course, given the format, and given that these works are on the wall, you could make those associations. But of course, the fact that they are abstract, and that's why I put these three together, the wood work in the middle and the metal work in the other end, they are both semantically abstract, meaning that they are non-objective. There's nothing illustrative about them. So you can talk about them as I'm actually doing in terms of their abstraction. But how do you talk about abstraction if not by the formal elements that constitute the abstract image, right? So and you may know, I didn't dwell on the wood sculpture, that even for the wood sculpture, he makes it possible for you to configure the work completely differently. They are made of slats of wood, so you can change the order. And once you change the order, the composition will be completely different, right? And so the same kind of shape shifting, at least visually, that you see in the metal work that I'm talking about actually exists in the wood sculpture. In the original moments when he exhibited it, he would take several pictures of different configurations of the same work. But what then happens is that when they enter into collections, they again fix them to whatever composition they think was his original composition. But if you had custody of the work, you can change them. This will completely look different, as this particular image shows now. So that same idea existed within the wood sculptures that he did in the 1980s and 1990s before the metal works.
Hi, Chika.
Yes.
What an incredible talk that has really made me reimagine everything that I've thought I knew really about Anatsui. Having been studying his work for so long, it makes me understand, like when I saw that Jack Shainman installation, in fact, even though I have known factually that this was true, that curators could do different things, without actually seeing that and engaging with how profound those shifts are, my understanding of that piece has rested static to that 2010 installation. And so it's just such an incredible way of understanding this work anew. My question was that while I understand the living aspect of this work, I'm wondering what has happened with commissions. So specifically, like in the Paris Triennale in 2012, probably,
Yes.
when there was the work on the side of a building.
Yes.
Can we talk about an original that has something to do with his own authority in the context of commissions, or is it nonetheless that across the board there is this shape-shifting built into it?
Well, they have a different life stories, actually. That work that you saw in Paris became fragments for the commission in New York, right? So that work does not exist. That's why it exists. That's why I say it exists archivally. So if you had pictures of it in Paris, good for you, because that work never existed anywhere else. Instead, he used the same materials for that commission, for the High Line installation that a lot of people saw in New York. And the work that he showed in Venice, the outdoor piece in 2007 that was in all the magazines on the planet, that same work you could never find anywhere because he actually recycled that work, and it's shown up as elements of other works that existed then, and those ones are now being configured over time. So there's a different kind of cyclicality, you might call it recycling, but I would like to think of it as, thinking about the life cycles, right, of the work that is in operation. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.